Hello everybody. Thank you for joining the second day of the Cultural Mobility Forum 2024. It is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, as I know we have more than 200 participants that registered to follow this conversation online. 200 plus participants from more than 60 countries. So we are probably quite late in some part of the world or quite early in some other part of the world. My name is Johan Flock. I'm the Director of Operations at On The Move, and I'll be introducing today's discussion for visually impaired participants and online participants. I'm a white man in my mid-40s with black hair, graying hair, with facial hair, and I'm wearing a green shirt with a blue jumper. So, yesterday we heard already many interesting thoughts, and in this forum where we talk about learning, I guess we started to learn a lot of different concepts, or to learn about the situation and the circumstances of many friends and colleagues from different parts of the world. As you know, this Cultural Mobility Forum, organized by On The Move and supported by our dear colleague from Belfast International, then the British Council, is dedicated to professional development and international mobility. For today's conversation, we will have two panel discussions with fantastic guest speakers and moderators, and we will start slowly going towards analyzing or trying to share the skills, competencies, and knowledge that we feel are important for the future. Yesterday, our discussions touched upon many key aspects of training and professional development. We talked about the frameworks and the power relations that structure our exchanges, and we discussed a lot about the influences or the perceptions and assumptions that shape our relationship to other contexts in the world. Many speakers shared their expectations and sometimes their frustrations when it comes to engaging internationally in cultural projects. But already we had very interesting ideas in terms of how to reshape or challenge the statu quo. And it feels that the role of the diasporas could be one way to shape or reshape the way we interact internationally. But also we heard that the digital space could be another way to create spaces where freely operators can exchange ideas, concepts, and knowledge. Of course, the question of resources is central, and I guess several speakers very openly shared their frustration in relation to where the funding comes from or where the funding is allocated. And in this conversation, I guess we will continue to discuss how we grow individually but also collectively. Yesterday was an interesting moment to wonder what is exactly our point of departure and what will be our point of arrival. And from the conversation, I felt that for many people in the room and probably many people online, the very idea of choosing one's destination is central and key. So to trust the artist and to trust all the cultural professionals to shape the answers, to know and develop ideas freely, and to have all the power structures trust them to know what is best for them. Well, quite a lot of interesting ideas were shared, and today, or this morning, for us, at least in the room, it is still morning, we will talk about internationalization from the peripheries. So this first conversation will be dealing about the notion of peripheries, or how Eluned have called it yesterday, the edge. So how do you do when you work from the edge? And the notion of periphery and the notion of center are, of course, very, full of connotations, full of assumptions, full of expectations. And I guess this first panel will touch upon the perceived centers and the perceived peripheries. So how oneself, in a context and according to very specific and unique circumstances, can navigate the idea of traveling toward a center, whatever this center is. And when we talk about traveling toward a center or operating from so-called peripheries, we not only touch upon their geographies, so where do we operate from, but also what part of what community or what group we operate from. And the notion of center or the notion of norm also comes with assumptions. Who gets to travel, who gets to access international opportunities and to grow. So this morning, I'm very happy to welcome a great panel again. And I trust that our moderator, Katelijn Verstraete, will be leading an exciting conversation. Katelijn has been based in Asia, and particularly in Singapore, for many years, and she operated for different key institutions. Not only as she founded herself a great hub for artists to grow, but also worked for institutions to establish, maintain, or develop fruitful international relations with Asia. She founded her own consultancy company a few times ago called ReflAction Works, and contribute to the work of many institutions or organizations like ITM, Unique, and On the Move. Katelijn, it's my great pleasure to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes. So good morning, everybody. Good evening. Good wherever you are, because that's what we're talking about, right, today. So thanks so much On the Move for inviting me. I have this long-standing connection with On the Move, obviously, and that's 20 plus years when On the Move was set up, when I was working at ITM with Milica and Marwane. And mobility has actually fundamental, of course, also in my my own professional path. But I found it also very important to be able to enable, to create opportunities, to reflect on that, and to look at the skills development. So being here is extremely important. But also that grounding, I think, Eluned, when you mentioned that yesterday, we are actually, and yesterday night when we went to do the walk, we had quite an insightful walk around, actually inspired by the Welsh language. So it really feels that we are at the heart of the Welsh, of the center of the Welsh language space, and at the same time at the edge of, I would say, the UK, but then in a European context. So it's all these multiplicities that are playing. So thanks for that. And just to maybe self-describe for visually impaired people, I'm a 54-year-old white woman with short blonde hair and with turquoise glasses, and I'm completely in blue, but I don't feel blue. So before we enter into the topic, yes, I have two wonderful co-panelists, Marwane, Fachane. Marwane, you're based in Rabat, in Morocco, and you're the managing director of the Hiba Foundation, set up in 2006 by His Majesty King Mohammed VI, and really about developing and promoting culture and artistic field in Morocco. Creative industries, education and vocational skills programs, cross-disciplinary, also very important, and you have a multi-purpose venue and the biggest recording studio in Africa. Amazing. And prior to that, you know, you build up your skills, your own skills in the Drosos Foundation in Tunisia about regional creative industries mobility programs. Yep. And then also working on a public program on youth, digital, social issues, so very broad, with the Ad Hoc Royal Commission. And you studied also in France. So
nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect. Wonderful to get your insights today on this topic. And then Kimari Spence, you are based in Belfast and coming from Jamaica, and lecturer in the arts management and cultural policy in Queen's University in Belfast, but also an adjunct lecturer in film studies in the Caribbean School of Media and Communication at the University of West Indies in Jamaica. So you're moving in between. Yeah. Research is obviously, being an academic, your thing, but especially on popular culture, right, and non-Western focus. Music industries and going very deep into the reggae and K-pop, two non-Western forms. So you worked with UNESCO on the representative list of oral and non-tangible heritage. You publish, I think the recent book was around global cultural economies. And you also on the board, you nestled yourself locally in Belfast with the MAC in Belfast, and also at Kingston Creative and Culture District. So you have both of you actually, you know, that sense of being at a center and being at the periphery, and these multiplicity you're dealing with. So, yeah, today we are building further on the conversations, right? We were exploring those motivations and needs to go from A to B, meaning a geographical movement. Often informed by forced mobility. We talked about that, away from challenging political and socioeconomic context, but often and also driven by exploring new markets. Lots of people, that's what they're looking for, new practices, but also exploring yourself. And I think that came through yesterday very much to what are we actually learning when we are in the process of mobility. But that internationalization, as Johan was saying, is also happening locally. The question is more at which point in your career do you do that A and B comes together, and that you're moving in those, the communities, working often with diaspora. And that's perhaps an interesting thing that we can kind of reflect on. And what values are informing all of that? That was the second conversation. So these pathways and the directions are not always that clear, and I think as often we go as water flows, the river flows, influences, personal choices, but especially where are you, who are you, where are you born, plays actually still the most important, and the time you're born, potentially too, that having that powerful passport or having the means to be able to move, being in a country that has a policy to support people, is all actually defining, what our trajectory is. So the question is, in which peripheries or which centers are you actually? So yesterday we started to talk about that notion of periphery and the margins. We'll unpack this more, obviously. But you could say that actually it can refer to regions, that geographically, but also communities, that actually that mindset or that working with communities that are distanced from the centers of power and influence and ideas and practices that are considered as less central, less normative, less, less interesting, which is, looking at the hierarchy between those spaces. So it's essentially, it's about access and participation in the cultural flow, be it interregional or global, what is, what's happening there. And when you look at the types of peripheries, it really, you know, you can look at it through different lenses, and that's why we kind of need to the focus of our conversation here. So you can come from a very small country like me. I'm coming from Belgium. I mean, being international is a given. Or you're coming from a rural area, you know, the opportunities might be less, depending on how you see your opportunities. You can come from a developing country where the economic situation might not be great. You can come from an indigenous community where you're being marginalized. You can come from a non-Western context where most of the references, be it in media, whatever, are from a Western context. Language minorities, and I think, you know, the place where we are Welsh, in which way is that, you know, feeling at the margins, but also an enrichment. You know, being at the margins is a rich space to be at, or being an emerging artist. So all these things can make you feel at the periphery, but often it's about a perception and a feeling, or you're being perceived by, and that's where hierarchy, I think, comes in. So that relative sense of, you know, what is it, that dynamic in between the two, and how you're actually visible in that space. And actually what we all want as human beings is to be visible and to be recognized and to be relevant in the context that we are in. And in a global digital context, that's not that easy. But it's all changing quite rapidly, you know, the spaces in many ways, in good and bad ways, I would say. I mean, driven by wars of displacement, but also driven by movements like the BLM and looking at decolonization as a space. So that dynamic has a big influence on mobility. Yesterday we talked a little bit of the South-South, but we also started to talk about that innovation and the experimentation that is happening. And I was struck also, you know, when you said it's actually also about kind of a mindset, and why would we learn certain things from certain people? Is it relevant for us, and what do we have to offer? So let's just go deep into it now, and look at that space between the peripheries and the centers, in the peripheries, and what it means for people, culture workers like us, in our trajectory, what knowledge and skills we need. So Marwane and Kim, so you've, as I said, you've both worked in peripheries and centers. I think my first question is, you know, what does it actually mean to you? You know, what does periphery and center mean in your context that you're in right now, and at your age, I guess, too? Sorry.
Sorry. My age. Well, good morning, everyone.
And could you self-describe
yes,
yourself?
Of course.
Yes, yeah.
That's going to be a funny one regarding the age.
Well.
My name is Marwane. I'm from Rabat, Morocco. I'm actually a decade older than On The Move. That would be early 30s. I'm wearing blue pants, a maroon, right? A maroon sweater over a white shirt. I have facial hair and black hair, and I'm Moroccan, so imagine an Arab guy with a microphone on the cheek. Yeah, well, when reflecting, as our discussions, our long discussions led us to, when reflecting on the center and the periphery, I come to accepting that the center and the periphery keep changing depending on where you are or where you are at the stages of your life, especially in the cultural sector. We can address the center and the periphery in the geographic term, and then if you're circular, the center would be the center of the circle and then the periphery would be around. But then we can also address it in terms of attention. If the attention of human beings all around the world are directed to a certain space or a certain activity or a certain population or festival or whatever, then the center is not geographic, it's where everybody's looking or what everybody's thinking about. So my idea of center and periphery have never been static. I've always addressed that idea of center and periphery depending on what we're talking about. And when at the foundation we have this conversation with the artists of what is the center and what is the periphery, I kind of refuse to see the developed countries as the center and then us developing countries or less developed countries as the periphery, because sometimes the interest is elsewhere. For example, You mentioned the Open Up Mobility Fund that I had the chance to work on the south to south region. That was a fund that funds artists to be mobile and to move from Morocco to Lebanon across the countries in between, and that would be Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, and Lebanon. And then no North country was mentioned in that, and then the center has never been in the North. It was just moving up south to south for the artists. Then the center would be questioned. Is it up north or is it just in between these countries? So the periphery also sometimes, let's just take Morocco as an example. The periphery, the center would be the capital of Morocco, as in any other capital of any other country in the world. And then the periphery would be those rural villages or those rural areas around it. Let's say, I don't know, London and Caernarfon. And I think my pronunciation of Caernarfon has really, really improved. Caernarfon. So, for example, for now, the center is Caernarfon. Caernarfon is holding the International Mobility Forum. While I don't know what's happening in London, but for us, what's important is the International Mobility Forum being held in Caernarfon. So yeah, I think as a first intervention, what I would like you to understand from this is that for me, the center and the periphery can change every day, every second, every hour, can change between two meetings, because for one meeting, we're talking about going to a festival in the US, in Canada, or in Brazil, and then in the next meeting, I would be talking to my team about social, creative enterprises that were helping in Fez, in Tangier, and then keeping an open mind about where's the center and where's the periphery opens new doors of development, because then, if for example, I'm thinking about the cinema sector in Morocco, the center would be Ouarzazate. I don't know if you know where Ouarzazate is, but it's like the city you would visit as tourists. It's in the southeast, desert, camels, dunes, blah, blah, blah. But then there is a whole value chain of cinema in Ouarzazate, biggest studios of recording, schools to teach cinema, funds for movie making. So we don't care about cinema in Rabat, Tangiers, or Casablanca, or Marrakesh. But then when you think cinema in Morocco, your mind would be, oh, what is that? The center of attention. So yeah, let's maybe wave away the geography of center and periphery and use it more in an intellectual way of where do the attention goes, when, and about what.
Thank you. It's about that connection to static versus dynamic, and what is important to us. But I'm kind of interested also how you look at this, Kimari. That multiplicity of views around center periphery.
So I'm let me self-describe. I am black woman with dreadlocks, black glasses, black lipstick, black dress, and multicolored collar, and what else should I say? And black Doc Martens. Yes. So free shout out to Doc Martens. So for me, I agree with Marwane and I disagree. So I agree in terms of the kinds of innovation happening and the import. Once something is centered somewhere, the fluidity of one's attention and mindset. But that said, I think I'm more of a skeptic. I see power relations everywhere, and I think by virtue of just growing up on a tiny island in the middle of a sea, so coming from Jamaica, it depends on what we're talking about. So if we're talking about center and periphery in terms of power and money and resources, unfortunately, that hasn't changed as much as we would like. Resources are still more or less in terms of the greatest amount conglomeration of resources. They're still in the global north. And it's sad to hear, and people might feel guilty, whatever, but it is what it is, right? But center and periphery doesn't mean that also all centers are created equally, and particularly all peripheries are created equally. So I'm from Jamaica, and so in a lot of ways, due to the history of colonization, slavery, IMF, etc., the center is London or New York or DC, depending on who's the president. But Jamaica in the Caribbean is also a center. So, I make jokes about, I'll talk to my Jamaican friends and be like, yeah, you hear about the election in St. Lucia? St. Lucia is another Caribbean island. And I'll have friends look at me, I don't really follow small islands. And I'm like, looking like, aren't we on a small island? I don't want to. So, in the Caribbean, Jamaica is a center. So a lot of times when people talk about the Caribbean, when you read it, you're like, I think they mean Jamaica, right? And then you think of centers where, in terms of language, so for people in the UK, when they say Caribbean, they mean English-speaking Caribbean. For Caribbean people, there are 4 Caribbeans. And because of the language and also the way things are still structured. So I was describing to someone yesterday how, when I used to be head of creative industry in the Jamaican government, there is a festival in Guadeloupe I have to go to. But all the roots are still on colonial things. British Airways only goes to English-speaking islands, etc. So I would have to get on the plane, go to the Dutch, because the Dutch don't have as many airlines, so they rely on the Americans in the Caribbean. And then go to there's a Dutch island that's split between the French. Go to the Dutch side, then get in a taxi, drive to the French side so I can tap into the French routes. That's even though this island is right there, right? So all that so when you talk about center and periphery, if we're talking about power and attention, there's still, in the center, it looks kind of the same, but there are regional differences. But when we're talking about innovation now, and unfortunately, that's not a new thing, I will say. Innovation has always happened in the peripheries of the peripheries of the peripheries, right? Because, I'm in Belfast, and the conversation there is that we're Belfast, in a lot of ways, like Jamaica, culturally rich, vibrant place, but it's the periphery of the UK. I mean, we talk about the other island, and we literally have to get on a plane just to go to the other island. But then they're not. But then they're also very aware that most people tend to have Irish and British passports that are powerful. So we might not have funding resources, but we can physically move faster. While as a Jamaican in Belfast, I need a visa just to go to Dublin. So, and then the innovations that happen on the center. So actually in my dual position, etc., one of the things, I study popular cultural industry. So I'm less at in practice, I'm at the grassroots, and in research, I'm at the front page of the Billboard magazine ends. So it's 2 different ends of things, and it's interesting to me to, when you're thinking about innovation, etc., the innovation, there is necessity innovation that just happens because a lot of the new things like digital innovations happens at the center. So for Spotify, so I always use the Spotify, South Korea has money. So for K-pop, but Spotify didn't get there till 2021, so they had to create their own platforms, Neva, etc. And so Spotify is fighting for its life in Korea because they already created new platforms to deal with, they weren't like, oh, please come to us. To deal with the lack of attention, they innovated. Jamaica also innovated, but didn't have the resources to create new platforms. So the innovation in the reggae industry was to have digital boutiques that would create a whole persona, a digital persona for artists in a whole other country. So US, UK, Canada, wherever. And so Spotify comes to Jamaica and everybody's like, oh, but we're already on Spotify. They're like, but we're not here. Yeah, we made that happen. So that kind of innovation, etc. But there's still, there's also the discussion of how do we go south to south in our own regions, like Marwane was talking about. But yeah, as I said, I agree with Marwane on the kinds of differences in center and peripheries in determining what you're talking about. But I think it's important, especially in this conversation, to realize just how embedded and entrenched power and old school colonial structures are. Like, I want to be, hopeful, let's all, hug each other. But the reality is, for some of us in this room, the reality of those power structures impact on our day-to-day existence, despite the fact that we've innovated them into daily insignificance, but they're still there.
Yeah, I mean, the conditions essentially.
Yeah.
You talk about the conditions, the macro and the
Yeah.
micro conditions, and what actually is important. But I just was wondering, I mean, we talked the other day about
Many things.
What shifts are coming about by, for example, big initiatives that are taking place.
Yeah.
For example, we talked about football again. But it's an interesting thing, with Morocco now, right?
Maybe it's a faraway example from the cultural industry section. Yeah,
And linked.
we did and linked, through the ceremonies. But for example, in terms of football is big in Morocco. Like you'd find any 8-year-old to 16-year-old playing with a ball in the street with 2 rocks marking the goal, and then they just run in, closing the street, and then when a car would pass by, they would just go on the side and then come back to the field. Let's say that. Morocco's performance in the World Cup was kind of impressive. Some people didn't even know where Morocco was on the map until Morocco was in the semifinals. Like, what? Who's
Where?
red flag? What's that? And then, I kind of enjoy going behind the screen and looking up. And Morocco rocketed the Google searches for a few weeks. Everybody was looking at Morocco, trips to Morocco, how much the flight costs to Morocco, and what's the currency in Morocco? Anyways, so that performance put a country on the map, and then it was followed by Morocco's organizing the World Cup in 2030 with Spain and Portugal. So these kind of follow-up events, and that's why we talked about football, because in terms of context, when many things from different elements are happening at the same time, it even fosters and strengthens the idea of center in our countries. Let's say France in Africa today is not so good looking. Political situation is, I really do hate talking about politics, but I'm just gonna cite it. So politically, the situation between France and some French-speaking African countries is complicated. And then on the side, Morocco is really on top in terms of football and hosting the World Cup in 2030 with Spain and Portugal, and is kind of the closest country in terms of, if you don't know that, now you know, it's the closest country to the European continent. It's 14 kilometers between the Moroccan border and the Spanish border. So it's really, at the same time, the center of attention for football, one of the most stable countries politically in the region. It's a kingdom and it's constitutional monarchy. And France is investing massively in the country because they see it as a bridge to a continent that is not talking to France anymore because of colonial history and stuff like that. So the World Cup, the performance in football, the political situation around Morocco, you can say that Moroccan people did nothing in terms of, they did not invest anything in this. But now it's a result because the context all around the country puts it in the center of the map in this region. Layering back on something that I really forgot to mention and that Kim Marie mentioned, let's divide the center into regional and then global center. For example, in that North African region, the center can be Morocco. Well, it's up for debate. But then what's really funny is that same idea as, oh, we don't talk about small islands. When I was in this ad hoc royal commission that worked on Morocco's development model, we worked on international relations and influence. And I do remember this conversation with top-notch people saying like, okay, let's talk about the relation between Morocco and Europe, and then Morocco and Africa, and then Morocco and the Arab countries, that's like on our right, because Morocco is far on the west. And they were like, no, we don't talk about Arab countries. We are an Arab country. And we're neighbors with Arab countries, and like, they do nothing interesting. Yeah. We don't talk about small islands. It's kind of the same. And it's really, curiously enough, we have this inability to look at our peers. We only look at what we consider being the El Dorado of development, being the center of power, money. We cannot think about peer-to-peer learning or peer-to-peer capacity building and then peer-to-peer international influence or whatever, but we always look up to whatever we consider up. Mentioned to that very funny movie of Meryl Streep, Don't Look Up. Yeah, some of you watched it. Yeah, so this, reflecting back, let's accept this humility of knowing where we are, our level, accepting also those models that you challenged of, I honestly accepted them, of media power, where the centers of media are, and the shift of conversation and the storytelling that whoever wants to put out there. Let's accept that the money, the power is somewhere because of whatever history, but let's also build innovative models that do not contrast with the existing models, but rather go around them. And that's what works for our countries. We can never imagine that we have the capacity to go straight ahead and challenge, let's say, a nuclear power or big political or media power, but we can also think about around. Closing on the idea that I could have never said this kind of statement prior to COVID, prior to the pandemic. But then when COVID hit, the most developed countries were not the ones who had the best response to the pandemic. And then, for the cultural sector, because you mentioned Spotify discovered what is supporting artists in the music industry. And they discovered that a Moroccan rapper called El Grande Toto makes more money than a French rapper because everybody in the Arab-speaking countries listens to Grande Toto and he expresses their social sufferance and can make a shit load of money playing in those, I don't know what words I can use. And we agreed that certain words are out of use.
Yes.
So in the pandemic, the money model completely changed for our countries. And during the pandemic, digital monetization became the major way for artists in our region to make money because people listen to music in their homes, because the live music stopped, festivals stopped, and Spotify and platforms like that. Now we even have a director of Spotify operations based in Dubai working on the full region. Spotify today has a playlist, the top 100 listened to in the Arab countries, that are produced by Spotify, which never happened, Spotify never looked at our countries prior to COVID. So, and this is a model that no economist studied before. Nobody imagined that the music industry could go mainstreamly on the digital platform. What artists make today out of money is impressively much more than what they do make on the live model. On the anecdote side, and this is the end, because of the digitalization of the music industry, some artists I discovered, sadly enough, cannot perform live. They can just do they are really, really famous on the platforms, but then when you invite them on stage with a microphone, they really, really, I'm really sure some of you on karaoke can perform better.
I saw you nodding a
No,
lot.
no,
but
no.
yeah.
So, you know, just to, because I know I started with a very door note, but I just felt I had to say it. But in terms of the innovation and, you know, what Marwane's talking about, the learning and the innovation that has always happened to go around obstacles, but also just innovation in and of themselves. So in our discussion yesterday, and you know, Kate's doing a great job of herding cats, Marwane and I. But in terms of innovation, one of the things we were talking about are the things that happen in our various countries that can't happen in the global centers, for example. So one, just the COVID was a particularly interesting one. I remember when COVID hit, I was in Southampton, so in England, and people were like, what do we do, whatever. I mean, the day the UK closed, the next day, Jamaica had already transitioned to online parties, right? So they were already like online sound system battles, because they realized we could do these international reggae sound system battles online. And that was that was the next day already. I mean, the disadvantage of being in England was if you were in Jamaica, they had already had the linkage with bars, so I could have ordered like a bucket of margaritas sent to my house. So I was in England like, why are we so behind?
Where are the drinks?
Yeah, like, I mean, the kind of response, and it took till Notting Hill Carnival, which was the summer, for like me to see that kind of innovation happening in England. So, you know, because people, you know, we bandy around this term resilience, and in the global cultural economy, innovation is also another term for resilience. You meet a problem and you know how to do it. When you come from certain places, that's like how you have to work. In terms of you know, the global culture, some of the things I noted, like, you know, I study K-pop, reggae, and also had done fieldwork on Bollywood, K-drama, and one of the enduring things was just how people are just used to work. So we were talking about how if I have an event to plan, I kind of look for like Jamaican people. Why Jamaican people? Is it just, oh, Kim only supports Jamaicans? Of course I support my people, but it's also the fact that Jamaicans are used to not having venues. We don't have anything like this in the country, like, and this is a small, but I'm like, no, right, we don't have it. So Jamaicans are used to creating venues out of parking lots, roadsides, whatever. You're like, yeah, I need this to be like a posh runway event in 2 hours. Done. You know? And so those are some of, but in the center periphery argument, as much as I you know, talk about the center of money and power, it's also assumed that innovation and knowledge is at the center. And I'm like, those are not the same things.
Yeah.
Yes, I will agree with the money and power,
Yes.
and it's changing in terms of the attention, but the innovation, come on. You know, like, even when you think about, and even South Korea is a different kind of periphery, because, I mean, we all know, South Korea is not a poor country, put it mildly. Well, no longer, because that's only 3 decades ago. In 1997, they were in hock to the IMF.
That's an interesting topic, actually, South Korea, right? Because it's all the different conditions coming together.
Right.
I mean, there's also
Yeah,
money there.
but even then, you know, more resources to kind of, their innovation might mimic it, but they're also innovating, like, all right, we can't. So, for example, in K-pop, and I'm using it, you know, by virtue of racial, you know, like, okay, we don't listen to the non-English speaking people of Asian sex star, like hot boys. No, you know, you don't look like Liam Hemsworth. Like, I can't. So using YouTube as the way, you know, like make it, and YouTube is the way that they've so there was a whole New York Times article that had come out about how nowhere was this thing advertised, like on the main radio. It wasn't on the Billboard charts, nothing. And they just sold out a whole stadium. They're like, oh, because they realized, all right, we're not the gatekeepers of top 100 radio, etc. So we just go, we're going to just put it up on YouTube. We're going to use social media, etc. And that's how it happened. In the era of reggae, when reggae was starting, Bob Marley was almost like, for those who know anything about the Bible, John the Baptist, spreading Rastafari, reggae, and Jamaica everywhere. And so there's a whole reggae scene that happens through festivals, etc., all over the world. And I know this because I still have a map in my office of reggae diaspora points. And there's only Antarctica there isn't a reggae festival, but we'll wait for it. But
penguins.
Yeah, no, the penguins might rock it up. But and that exists and innovates, etc. Even though when you look at the charts, it doesn't track. So there are all these other spaces and knowledge. So the learning is assumed, and in terms of some of the funding models that have been talked about, it's assumed that the learning is coming from the center. And I'm like, really? Because how many? One of the reasons I went to do my PhD was that went back to school and became an academic was because I was sitting as a head of creative industries, and to get certain funds, etc., you also have to get the consultants, etc., and you have to be nice because you can't be like the unruly natives that don't listen when people are trying to help. But on the other hand, you're like, this is not Sweden. No, but so you literally have to be teaching the people who are sent to help you about your context. And I was like, what, I could do this myself. Let me just go and become the doctor, and I will do this, And so that was and it's not to say some of the consultants were amazing. So I'm not knocking, but a lot assume that because it works in Sweden, it should work in Kingston. I'm like, dude, Kingston is a whole other beast, whole other cultural policy infrastructure, whole other resources, a more collective approach. So every artist you see has a collective around them. Yes, they like their friends, but also they realize there's no public funding structure. So around them, they have like a whole incubator system set up around them. Taylor Swift doesn't have 5 artists around her that she's trying to make it, but that's almost like the standard model because there are no major labels, etc. So every artist does this themselves.
But that's the main
you know
issue,
what I'm saying?
right?
Yeah.
When the periphery is really trying to build a model that is like the center. When the periphery doesn't accept that maybe
the center doesn't know about the new
other
model.
ways of doing exactly. There are other ways of doing that same thing. Maybe let's not make the whole world as a one size doesn't fit all. Let's accept.
You mentioned about Netflix also. The approach Netflix took actually it existed already somewhere else,
existed, right? Because in Nollywood, they're like, all right, we had the DVD distribution, and but that's physical, but you have a whole diaspora, and they wanted to see it as well, and then also throughout the continent. So Iraqqa comes up and buys these rights, and rights are only valuable if someone wants them. So they were cheap at first. They're not so cheap anymore. And they just populated the platform, and so Iraqqa kind of looks like Netflix for African film content, but it's different how you can pay, because they realize not everybody is banked, so you have mobile payment.
Yeah.
You can also buy a one movie subscription. You can buy a language group, because I only want to watch films from Ghana, etc. And there are similar platforms for Indian movies. So Bollywood is just only the Hindi film industry. There's a Telugu film industry, Bengali, etc., etc. And you can, and the last one was Enthusiast, and there are probably more. And that model of, that we will distribute and do this itself. Reggae has like, in the era of cassettes, we had like the guys that sold cassettes on the road. So I wrote a whole paper about this. I know way too much about the cassette ninjas, which is what they're called. The cassette ninjas. And they would literally have an informal network throughout the UK, US, Canada, wherever, and they'd supply. So I remember when I worked at UNESCO, I'm like, a dance happened in Jamaica the weekend before, and by the next weekend it was in the corner shop, because they were like, yeah, no, the DVDs came from Jamaica, you know, because someone had put, because you realize none of the Hollywoods are interested in, but that doesn't mean we're just going to stay in our place. We have diasporas.
But it's about relevance too, isn't
Yeah.
it?
And I wanted to note one other thing with the diaspora connection, which might be interesting. I talked about diaspora as an audience, but also diaspora as you know, a means of funneling things. So for Kingston Creative, and it's cropped up in Bollywood, but let me go to a Kingston Creative example. We got a fund from, we got a grant from the Open Society Foundation, right? But you have to have like a charity status that doesn't exist, and we would have to be too. So we knew there were all these diaspora organizations, because, you know, I mean, if you've been familiar with Jamaicans, everywhere we go, we form an association. We try to brainwash everybody into Jamaicanness, really. It's a superpower. But, you know, we contacted one of the larger diaspora associations in New York who had the status. And so we negotiated with Open Society Foundation to fund that organization. Yeah, and then, but it was for a Caribbean program, so the 4 Caribbeans, there's no bank that exists in the 4 Caribbean. So then we had to negotiate with Western Union, because Western Union is everywhere you want to be. And Western Union could get funds all through the region. The diaspora funds families, like, you know, people work and send back to families, etc. So Western Union, so diaspora organization and Western Union was the bank, and we had to negotiate with them. And OSF was like, what? Why not a bank? Which bank? We don't even have one bank for the whole English-speaking. Like, you assume their structures, they don't talk to each other. But Western Union will get your money anywhere, I swear. Look, and I don't work for Western Union, and I will note, I don't work for them.
I mean, what I'm hearing is a profound...
Structural.
What I'm hearing is a profound entrepreneurship, actually.
Yeah. Yep.
Coming from a real drive to do things and to express yourself and to have that diversity.
But there's a respect on both sides. I respect that innovation. Yeah. You know, like, not just, oh, why can't it? Respect that this is a valid and probably sometimes better way to do things.
We actually expect to surpass the problem. You don't see a problem and stop. You expect that someone somewhere will innovate in a way to solve it. I don't know how to explain it, but it's in terms of mindset. You don't see a fund problem or a legal problem or a structural problem as a problem. You just ask your Moroccan buddy, do you know someone who can do something?
Like, that informality,
that level of informality, honestly, it's what works. But, let's just go back a few minutes to mobility, as it's an International Mobility Forum. So at the foundation, in terms of when talking about the periphery, I received this request for an internship. That's where, as far as I received this request for an internship for a student at the Fine Arts University in the north of Morocco. Pretty good profile. Then we go to the interview, it's remotely, and I ask, what did you think about this particular exhibition at the National Museum of Fine Arts, blah, blah, blah. And then I hear, I have never been to the National Museum of Fine Arts. Okay? Master's degree in Fine Arts, who has never been to the National Museum of Fine Arts. For me, it's like kind of a doctor who has never been to doctor school. Doctor school. I'm 8 years old. Anyways, so, and I say, why? And then this sentence is the reason why we started the ASFAR Fund for local mobility in Morocco. The school didn't have in their curricula anything that planned a visit to a fine arts museum or a museum other than in the same city. And then it got even bigger when I discovered that many local artists refused to do gigs in other cities. I'm just talking about within Morocco, because wherever they're invited doesn't cover their travel expenses or their hotel expenses or their per diem. So it's something like 20,000 euros between the foundation and an international partner. And we launched the first calls, and we say we're going to fund 2 streams. The first one would be students in the arts and cultural sector who need to move either to discover a museum or to go, I don't know, do a photography residency in the Sahara, or just be a volunteer in a festival and observe how a festival works behind the curtain, stuff like that. And then for all artists who already have a gig or a residency or something that proves, we launched the first call for application, and nobody applies. Nobody applies. Because in terms of mindset, it's a new model. Nobody expected someone to pay for your taxi or your train ride that costs 4 euros from Tangier to Rabat. Nobody expected that I would pay for your hotel, because the global, the average amount was around, because we closed the first edition last year, and now we're launching the second one, but the average amount was around 50 to 60 euros, including per diem, transport, and accommodation. In terms of mindset, nobody in Morocco thought, oh, the Hiba Foundation will cover that without asking for anything in return except 3 answers to 3 simple questions when you go back after the mobility. But then what we did, and this is kind of just a reflection back, if any one of you wants to launch a regional or local mobility fund, I went on and I called all the festival directors and all the venue directors. That was like 2 weeks of calls on my phone. And then all the residency organizers, and I said, for all your people accepted, or all your artists invited, or all your students at the universities who want to move, if you get them accepted, send me the list of acceptance, and I will cover whatever costs you do not cover. I will just ask them to fill a form, and then we managed something like 600 fund for mobility in local Morocco. For some of you who know Visa for Music, so the foundation organizes Visa for Music. It's a professional music market for African and North and Middle Eastern music professionals. The ASFAR fund, ASFAR means travel, trips, but it rhymes with art, so ASFART, funded all the Moroccan musicians who came to Visa, not only to play on stage, but also to meet all the professionals. So periphery to periphery also works. It's not necessarily periphery to center. It's also, how can I be mobile in my own periphery, in my own regional, non-developed, segregated, alone in this small island place? Know that the struggle is real, and people do not also need to book a plane to go. And then on the informal channels.
But it's an interesting thing you say for that person who studied, who had actually not even maybe thought about going to see that museum. So what is the pathway of people, you know, in terms of their own career development, personal development?
Well, that's a really...
when you come in when you are in the periphery, you know, the periphery being reference Rabat, potentially. You know, what is that? From your work now, how do you see that trajectory, and where even does the international come in?
No.
Right.
Absolutely not. You only know what you're told.
Yeah, no, and you know, even in this, like we had to structure this whole value chain, and because I remember Kate had asked us about, you know, what about the value chain, and again, you know, you have to go from where you are, and then in your country. So Morocco is bigger than my country, okay. So for us, it's like 2 cities, and then Jamaica is over. But you know, even getting in the rest of the region. So even going back to the point about like big events, right? So we've had this thing of it's all islands in the Caribbean. So you literally need to get on a plane or a ferry to go to another island, etc. And one of the things was just free travel. So with the different passports, and a European can travel much easier, EU citizen can travel much easier through the Caribbean than I can. and it's Cricket World Cup in like the early 2000s that kind of opened it up because we had to find a way for people to be able to move between islands fast, and then we just never went back, thank God, right? So at least you can travel through the region easily visa-wise. Again, we come back to plane routes. It's way easy. So I was, in this whole thing of like visas, etc. The easiest way for me to travel through the Caribbean region is to have an American visa, because I need to go through Miami. That's the fastest way, right? I remember stopping in Miami after 5 years of just transiting, and they put me in a little room because they couldn't understand. You never stop. Why are you stopping here now? But, and just that. So even through the region, one of the reasons people also don't respect the regional aspect is also it's easier to go north in some but then you think about places like India, similarly, visa-wise. For Bollywood, it's easier for them to go to London than to go to that region because of drugs. So there are some of these structural issues as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I do want to we talked a lot about music and actually
Yes,
digital. Coming from your background. But I was actually going to backtrack a little bit about that, because I think COVID was a catalyst
game changer
in many directions. What actually of these innovations states, and how did they come for other kind of art forms? What is it that the digital space can do for people to develop their skills, go internationally, and so on?
I like how the conversation. So yesterday morning when we talked about traveling, print, carbon print, etc.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go there now. So I like how the conversation about digital today. I was in Abidjan for the Massa, and I heard that some people didn't get the visa to come to Ivory Coast. This is funny. European people didn't get the visa to be in Ivory Coast for the Massa, and this was the first time I hear about this. When an artist cannot present. Let's say a theater piece, because they didn't get the visa, they would send the script to other comedians, and it would be played in a non-presence way. I don't know if you know this concept, but it's a rather interesting new one. So the digital era is really being, let's say, pushed very hard on the artists cross-sector, and asking them to reduce their carbon print. Let's not take planes. You travel with a big guitar and a big amplifier. Can't you just send your track? Blah, blah, blah. But I just want to say, we haven't been traveling that much. We haven't been traveling that much.
It's not our footprint.
It's not our carbon footprint. It's yours. Can you not travel, and can we travel more? I mean,
yeah.
Let's reflect back on history. Who did that hole in the sky? That wasn't our planes.
No.
Our airline companies have less than 60 years old.
And I will note we said this more colorfully yesterday.
Yes.
Far more colorfully. But we were just where are we?
Exactly.
And I will add another point, a point that we've talked about innovation. We'll add the livelihood part. So it's said like, environmentally you shouldn't travel, you should send your script. So, but what does that mean in terms of the payment? Because one of the reasons for traveling isn't, all right, I want to see the world, whatever. It's the reality that especially in some, like you cannot earn in that market to support yourself.
Exactly.
It's not a space that. So, for example, reggae artists. I know.
Artists, reggae.
Yeah, but that a lot of reggae and dancehall artists perform in the region because they love to perform. This is an audience that holds them to a high standard, which is why you like the music. Like we're used to good music, etc. But can we pay them? So and then in the region, there's a ceiling. So of course they're paying them in the region, but what you can pay for livelihood, because frankly, lack of respect for creative artists, etc. We haven't paid them in the way they can live. So when you say, you can't travel, then how do I earn? I remember giving an example of like a COVID innovation where you had the artist in Jamaica. So you remember I just
Yeah,
played
the video.
yeah, the artist in Jamaica, and then they were collaborating with an artist with artists in London for the BBC, and so they booked out a hall and they like projected the art simultaneously, and they were playing simultaneously, and I was struck, but also, you know, the first question that came from Marwane was, did he get paid the same? I'm like, right. No, he was an artist that had the management team that made sure that he got paid the same rate as if he was in London. But a lot of time, this whole, yes, you know, this whole notion of footprint also means that, oh, I don't have to pay you. Like, so you have used this playwright
I'm
script.
bringing you to Europe.
But then, no, you must pay them because he didn't actually come. And I'm like, no, if we're going to do this right, then it means then that I mean, I'm not supportive of it. I agree with you on the carbon footprint. But say we're playing along. Say we're playing along with this. Then you need to pay the same. It needs to also mean that
And
the
it talks
remuneration
about what
has
kind
to,
of
so the
relations.
livelihood has, right, and the power
You know,
relations
the power
of the,
relations,
right.
the equitable, you know, at which points.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's, I mean, you're bringing up a lot. I'm looking at time also.
Yeah.
I think a lot of things we touched upon, and I'm sure that in the audience we would have questions for you around that or online. So what are the reflections around that being in the periphery?
I assure you, preparation for this was as active as this. We were as passionate as yeah.
Thank you so much. Honestly, this is a great way to start the day because I feel actually lively, like I want to jump up and things like that. So,
Don't let us stop you.
I really enjoyed this talk. And actually, listening to you just reminded me of something. So I run an artist residency, but it was founded by Bessie Silva. It's called the Asika Art School. And we move across Africa. Our residency is a roving residency, but in a text that she wrote, she quoted the Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he says that knowing oneself and one's environment was the correct basis of absorbing the world. That there could never be only one center from which to view the world, but the different people in the world had their culture and environment as the center. The relevant question was therefore of how one center related to other centers. Right. Okay. And I think that that's really something that this kind of conversation brings to mind. So there are no peripheries, there are centers.
Perfect.
That's,
and where we all are or where we sit is the center. So thank you for that. And I have another little thing around Morocco. And so I'm based in West Africa. So to me, Morocco, you are my neighbor as Northwest, but the conversation is around the Arab world and the separation between North and South because of the Sahara has positioned a country in West Africa as neighbors with a country in the Middle East. And I feel like there's something around that we need to really grapple with.
Well, I think that's let's not forget which is something really that makes me really sick. It's a colonial heritage. The division, North Africa, sub-Saharan countries, West, East, and South Africa is not something that Africans decided. It's something that Europeans, when they were living in our countries, minding our minds, did to facilitate the language and the. Do you know how Africa was distributed between the Europeans? It was a rule and a pen, and it was like, okay, France will get this, Spain will get this, Portugal will get this, and that division of Northwest is the way to organize that. What's sad is that today, that same organization really directs all the fundings and all the cooperation agreements. There is no way that Africans can all work together if not defined by North Africa, as in Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, and Libya, Egypt being considered in the Middle East, and then West Africa, South Africa, Central Africa, and And it's not just geography, people, it's really the way administratively things work.
Actually, and that brings me to one question also. I mean, you're teaching, cultural policy, and lots of people who go into the culture sector go in an arts management course these days or anything else. And I was wondering in which way what you're teaching is actually decolonized, and
So-
how are we in the West also more aware about what's happening?
So, two questions. One, I mean, a flag, like one of the citations for this section is a piece I wrote on decolonizing arts management curriculum. And one of the things I came away with was, it needs to be more systemic than left to the individual lecturer. I would say I still have ways to, I'm sure there are blind spots I have just by virtue of my own experience, but not every lecturer comes into the place having lived in 11 different countries, going north, south, peripheries, whatever. And so my approach to decolonial might be broader, but not even there, because I'm sure there are like linguistic issues. I'm like, do I have anything from the Arab world? So it should be more like subjects decolonizing. It shouldn't be left to the individual lecturer. Just because you're nice doesn't mean you're decolonial, right? So let me add, right? So let me add, in terms of how I teach it. So, I mean, it's been a development. And as you were talking about the administrative divisions, one of the things I start with is we talk about cultural policy, and we have this term about implicit cultural policy, as in economic policy that is a cultural policy. Immigration policy, as we've talked a lot about, that in essence is a cultural policy, who gets to come, whatever. And I always put up the three maps, just to give an example, 3 maps of the African continent. First, African continent prior to 1880. It's in European books, it's the Berlin Congress. In Caribbean books, it's the Berlin Scramble. The division. And words mean things, right? So you put the pre-1880 or 1880, I forget the term, thing where it's like, Bantu people, Swahili-speaking people, and then you put when it's like divided upon European colonization, and then the modern day political structure. And I'm like, this is an example of one of the large, like one of the most macro example of implicit cultural policy. The Berlin Scramble wasn't about how do we teach people our language or, spread our culture. It was about who gets to economically ravish where. Exactly. Right? But it's now become a thing where even to this day, in the modern, politically independent African continent, we still speak these languages. The food is still there. I was talking about when I moved to India, all right, at the time I didn't speak any Hindi, whatever, but I did speak cricket because I'd also been colonized by the British. I did know what Horlicks digestive biscuits were, so I had to explain that to like my Danish, this is Horlicks, because we've been colonized by the same people, and there were things that wasn't, all right, I don't know your quote-unquote indigenous culture, but I do know the British colonial culture, like that we can start, and that's a big cultural part. So that's an example of just how I teach, like, understand that the policies we have today are a product of the historic. So if, even as cultural workers, when we're doing this kind of international work, whether regional or whatever, or however, we also need to actually, so it's responsibility to know the history of the relations that we're continuing.
Our respect.
Yeah. And be reflexive about it. I
hope
that answers the question.
Knowing about the innovations and the differences. Back and forward, both things are so important. It's not that I'm not hopeful, but I'm like, history has been embedded in so much. Like, as you say, we're like, we don't really talk to you, but it's not because we don't like you. We just don't even have structures to talk to you.
In Morocco, young people don't speak French anymore. They speak bad English. They can't write this sentence they pronounce in English. They literally cannot write it. but it's a rejection, a total inherent to their cultural rejection of the French language. And they don't speak French. It's just like they're just like rapping in the street and speaking English and Arabic.
It's like yesterday they talked about Russian.
It's not that I don't like
Georgia.
you as a French person. It's not that I don't like France. It's just that we have history. It's like an ex that you did not really break up with because you fight. It's just like, there's too much in there. Okay, we're kind of fed up. Let's try something else. I'm looking at the other side. Instead of looking at the Mediterranean, now I'm looking at the Atlantic. And I'm actually really quite impressed by how it influences the communication on the ministry and administrative level. The Ministry of Youth is today communication only posting in English and Arabic because he knows that the audience only wants English and Arabic. So this kind of, the cancel culture movement was really the, let's say the catalyst of ownership of, okay, I am accepting this, I choose what, and I choose who I want to be, and I choose where I want to go, and how do I want to shape my identity as an ex-colonized, not colonized anymore
It's
person.
an interesting thing what you were saying about centering.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
No,
what is
well,
my
I
center,
just
what
I
is
want
me, and how do I relate
but I
with
want
the
to
world?
add to
You can
Oyinda.
ask questions.
Yeah, I wanted to add to
So, more
Oyinda.
questions indeed.
I wanted to add to Oyinda to say that
One here, one there.
Yeah, I wanted
Other?
to add that, you know, also I realize that with the history, we also in this room have a responsibility to do something different. Like, but, you know, we're not, knowledge of it doesn't mean we're trapped by it. That's
Yeah.
Is this working? It's working,
Yes.
okay. I'm Matthew Covey from Thomas Dot in New York. First, an observation, Marwane. As many of you know, I spent a lot of my life traveling around to music conferences and festivals, educating, helping people understand the US visa process for artists and how to get into the US. Mostly in Europe, where dozens, if not hundreds of people show up at these to find out what it takes to get to America. I was invited a couple of years ago to go to Visa for Music and was very pleased to discover that when I got there and set up to do my dog and pony show, no one came, which I thought was kind of amazing and slightly depressing, but also fantastic. So kudos to Visa for Music for that culture. I also wanted to ask a question, as somebody who's been in the music industry in New York City for 30 years, the relationship between the center and the periphery, I feel like there's a dynamic here that hasn't been touched on, and that's the notion of gentrification in the center.
Yeah.
And the fact that I feel like my experience in the music sector has been people coming to the center, because nobody's actually from New York, and then leaving, whether it's going to Prague in 1991 or going to Berlin in 1991 or to Seattle or to Athens, Georgia, or now, I'm sorry, to Lisbon. Everyone's always leaving to go somewhere where they can afford to do their art, and it's not the institutions remain, but the artists go elsewhere. And I think that as we think about the ways to connect the centers to the periphery, we also have to recognize that the artists are not always staying there. And I guess that's a question about even here in North Wales, when we're talking to the artists here, a lot of those artists are coming from somewhere else because they can find a house in Anglesey that they can build. And I'm just interested in that dynamic and if it's something that people would see as relevant to this conversation.
Maybe we can do back and forth. Thank you very much, Matthew, for the question. Very, very interesting about gentrification. Except it's a very white northern concept. My artists do not know what gentrification means, and even though they would want to jump on a plane and go to Lisbon to make the prices of prices higher, they don't have the visas, they don't have the access, and they don't know the concept of gentrification. So in Morocco, we kind of started, I used that word one time because concept store opened in a shady street, and I said, ce quartier va se gentrifier. This neighborhood is gentrifying. And like people look at me like, WTF? and so it's interesting though that the cities you mentioned are all on the north side of the planet. The concept of gentrification is really also linked to this ability and this liberty of movement and whatever passport you're holding. Between brackets, I'm super proud of us because we did not talk about visas at any point of this conversation this morning.
We
Although
we
did about yesterday.
Was I?
we did. I did.
But what I'm trying to say is, and maybe this image of how young people in our countries and Europe can circulate can also explain a bit more what I'm saying. When you're 18 in Europe, in France, Italy, Spain, you can just, with your identity card, hump on a train and travel at least to 17 countries, right? So let's just take a step back to mindset. The fact that you are not able, but you know that you're able. I don't know if you sense the difference.
Potentiality.
You know you're able to move easily by simply going to a train station and booking a 17-country tour with your identity card. So you're 17 and you can do that. Now let's go to Tunisia or to Morocco and you're 17. And you want to do the same. You don't even know that on the other side of the Mediterranean they can. So even the concept of being mobile is not defined the same in our mindset. I only knew and I can only hold this type of conversation because I was privileged enough to do my master's degree in France. But if you're in Morocco, studied in Morocco, even though you have a higher education degree, there are some concepts about mobility and about trips and about access that your mind does not know, not because you're underprivileged, but because they're not supposed to, your country does not supposed to have access to that. Right. And that I feel gentrification is a concept that really gets close enough to this kind of concepts.
Then let me add nuance. So, completely agreed in Morocco or on the space of maybe the wider North African space. But in Jamaica, gentrification is an issue. What was interesting was one of the things we've had to convince our politicians is that it's not a good thing. Right? So here the whole others, they're like, you mean get rid of the poor artists and the rubber roses and get like rich people in? Isn't that amazing? Isn't that a good thing? And you're like, no, that's not a good thing. Right? So first we have to convince them that this is not a good thing. So that tells you about how people see the classes that, you know. Then on the other hand, that's also a conversation about livelihood. Part of the reasons artists leave, and it's almost accepted that they can't afford it, why are we not paying our artists? You know? So there is also that concept of it, so which is why I'm very clear of, like, you know, in terms of the digitalization and whatever that has been happening, that digital performances should be paid so that they're able to stay there. So that's the second point. Third point is, I will note in the space of a cultural arts district, because this is, you know, the other things I study are very much like the industry. In terms of the cultural arts district, say of Kingston Creative, where it's based in a location, one of the things we've done is, one of the reasons we had to convince the politicians that this is a bad thing is because we realized that particular issue of protection of housing, what they call it, stabilized rent, etc. That's something that's a government thing. Like, no matter with our best intentions as a cultural organization, we don't run space. And so we had to convince it because we're like, we can see that if, as the art district, which is in it's in, for those who listen to Bob Marley, you know Trenchtown, you know the song. You know, Trenchtown is a poor part of the city, etc. But if Trenchtown becomes beautiful, everybody's going to want to live in Trenchtown, and the people who are in Trenchtown can no longer afford Trenchtown. You know, so we've had to be like, okay, before it happens, can we, you know, have rent stabilization, sort out people's ownership, etc., and those are government things. So we've had to step out. I mean, we're arts and culture, but we literally, like, out of responsibility, no, we have to step to government, you know, which is not creative or whatever, because as a duty of care. So even in the spaces, like, you know, the issue is, it's not that arts and culture shouldn't strive. The issue is, so where are the protections for artists as people? You know, Republic has universal basic income as part of that, trying to get that done. So that's a question I throw out, livelihood issues, but also that for those issues, that's government. And so there's an advocacy duty of care for organizations. Well, I think so, yeah.
Thank you. We had other questions. I think here you had a question.
And then Isabel. Okay.
And Isabel also, you also? Also here, eh? Yeah. First, yeah.
Yeah, who first?
Here, yeah. Oh.
Okay, thank you. My name is Isabel. I'm a freelance cultural consultant.
Can you speak up?
Yep.
Yes. So I'm Isabel. I'm a freelance cultural consultant, and I've worked also on different development programs in internationalization. And coming back, it's more a comment, but it's interesting when we're talking about a center and periphery, because what we've observed, so I'm speaking from a northern point of view, based in France, that actually the support programs that we're doing for internationalization is a lot about unlearning. We're doing a lot of unlearning for the cultural workers and artists. So it's about creating those skills, unlearning the way that international development has been taught in Europe, from my perspective. And so it's also about making the artists that we support decide of which will be their center, which was touched upon yesterday. And it's also about deconstructing the subsidies for mobility that's coming from the cultural diplomacy or their agencies, because this is also a way of defining where the mobility is going. So, of course, we need those subsidies, but it's about deconstructing them and relating them to the real sense. So I feel that the word international is actually embeds a very strong relation to the notion of center and periphery. And maybe if we change that word, or anyways we question the way that we're using the word international, we might also succeed in creating better dialogue or diversity in the relation to periphery and center, since it's more about different localities, people that are dialoguing, than nations that are dialoguing.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have, you also a question.
Hi, thank you so much. Nike Jonah, Pan-African Creative Exchange. I think it's so timely, because this is a conversation that has been part of my narrative for like the last 10 years. And I guess I just wanted to share something around a way of thinking about how we talk about innovation in the centre and the periphery. And one of the frameworks that we used to use when I worked at the Arts Council England, and we were constantly looking at this peripheral and centre, and one of the frameworks we used to sort of further explain it in relation to why diversity is key to excellence in the arts was the standpoint theory. And it comes out of 70s feminist literature. And what it just basically says is they've sort of got this drawing of a bowl, and the bottom of the bowl is the center. I think it's a bit like the ballroom and being in the balcony, and they talk about how those on the periphery may be marginalized in terms of their positionality because they don't have the same access to power, but their overview is extremely comprehensive because they're constantly looking and seeing where the gaps are and seeing where the opportunities are. And often those on the periphery are marginal. There might be someone who's disabled working with somebody who's got another barrier. And what happens is the innovation and the most exciting things happen in those spaces.
Yeah, exactly.
Amen.
But what the centre often does, and we saw it all the time, and I think an example for me was the pop-up. So in England, there was a lot of city centres that were becoming sort of like empty. And to avoid getting heavy taxes or actually you would pay more in taxes if you left your shop empty because they were trying to avoid these city centres becoming places that were with antisocial behaviour. So some artists got together and said, can we just pop up until you find someone to rent? And so they pop up. Somebody in the centre sees it and goes, oh, I'm going to call it pop-up shop. And next thing you know, they're hearing their own ideas back to them, but packaged slightly differently.
Marketed.
Marketed very nicely. And I think there's got to be structures that kind of like protect that, because we constantly see that. And I think I was talking to one of my panellists, I'm on the panel later, about a very well-known, an academic that I like very much, finding out that he's ripping off people that he's connecting with, those people that are in the peripheries. And I often think, and it's interesting, I was working with a German composer, artistic director in a contemporary music group who said, but I don't want to be in the centre. I want to be up here.
Exactly.
And I said, well, you're in contemporary music, contemporary classical music. You're not quite in the centre, but you're certainly not up here. That's all I wanted to offer.
Thank you.
So I think the question, perhaps the question around centres and peripheries, it's actually not about centres and peripheries, it's about multiplicity of centres and this diversity that is there, but allowing and giving the conditions for this, to flourish, with the flexibility, the adaptability, and the empathy also of that learning and unlearning space. So thanks so much for this.
I think the two connect a lot.
Absolutely.
The unlearning and then the recognition of the necessity of a wider perspective that comes from when you're in a periphery.
And also the unpacking, what do things mean, like gentrification. So I think, a good learning space.
And let's not forget that at the end, centre and periphery for the artists is majorly linked to livelihood.
Yes.
There are no artists that want to go to the centre because it's the centre. It's because they've consumed the periphery and they just want to be able to pay their bills.
They just
and
want to be
livelihood.
an artist.
Yes, livelihood.
Voila.
Thanks so much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody. Also
thank you, everyone.
And keep learning and unlearning together.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. A big thank you to Katelijn, to Marwane, and Kim Mary for this rich conversation. And I love the idea that we threw many new words in our conversation. So we keep adding and building. So we have a small break now. So we have half an hour, and we will reconvene in this room, but also online.